especially important in a church that practices infant baptism, because people who have been baptized before their awareness of the promises made on their behalf deserve an opportunity to stand up in front of God and everybody and to say yes to all those things again. It's not as if they did not take the first time around, but everyone needs and deserves that opportunity to make public affirmation of them and to receive the imposition of hands. The Anglican Communion, believe it or not, is the only communion in the world that completely reserves confirmation to a bishop. So congratulations for confirmation. In our church, you get a bishop whether you want one or not. So that's one pastoral aspect of confirmation. The other one is that it gives us an opportunity to express identity and affinity with the Episcopal Church. So those who come from another tradition of belief, where there's already been either a profession at the time of baptism. You know, I grew up Southern Baptist, so I distinctly remember when I was baptized. I had said yes at that point, but I had not said yes in the context of the church where I had, from my early 20s on, had intended to live the rest of my life. So confirmation then gave me an opportunity to make that affirmation in the church that I then called home and still do call home. Who's being received today? Anyone being received? So everyone's being confirmed, huh? Well, you're being received, right? So typically when I receive people, I get lots of Baptists, get lots more Roman Catholics, a rare Orthodox Christian who comes our way, and a lot of Lutherans. There you are. And there used to be this practice by which we would reconfirm anyone who had not been confirmed by a bishop in the historic succession. So it used to be that we would confirm Lutherans and not receive them. Well, let me tell you about something that irritates Lutherans, and that is to say that their confirmation didn't count, because Lutherans have had to endure a lot to get from not being confirmed to being confirmed. Often a year or two of weekly confirmation catechism classes. So I have in balance between baptism and confirmation. I have said often, and I'll stand by this, that I have a high theology and regard for baptism and a comparatively low theology and understanding for confirmation. It remains a necessary pastoral sacrament, but it's not baptism. We don't stand up and say, now we're going to reaffirm our confirmation covenant. That's not the way we do it. The point of reference is the font, and that's where confirmation draws its entire meaning. I learned through a startling experience that my job is to confirm, and it is to confirm anyone whom the parish presents to me. That is to say, you present them, I confirm them, that's it. And I'll tell you how I learned that. Diocese of Missouri, where I was bishop for 18 years, had a partnership with a diocese in South Sudan. And the bishop there, his idea of a good time when we would visit there was to troop the whole team of missioners to every village in the diocese and make the bishop, the visiting bishop, confirm until I dropped. I'd go to 4 or 5 villages on a given day and confirm 50 to 100 people at each place. So I was just a confirmation machine when I would go to the Diocese of Louis. And I just sort of get in a groove and get the formula down. I gave up on trying to confirm using names because I couldn't understand what the names were. And there's no paper in South Sudan, so they couldn't even write it down on a scrap of paper to show me their names. So I just confirm and confirm and confirm. And I came, and they're very serious about preparation, by the way. They have exacting criteria for manner of life and for preparation before anyone would be presented to be confirmed. So I was confirming, came down the line, and there was this little bitty boy. He might have been 7 years old. And that's just not the way it's done there. And I know that I visibly startled when I saw him. And the bishop, who was sitting in the bishop's chair, watching all this and enjoying himself as some other guy was doing all this confirming, he jumped up out of his chair and he came running over to me and said, "Oh, you must confirm him. He has nodding disease and he's going to die soon." Nodding disease is a neurologic disease. It's fly-borne, and it's geographically specific to that part of the Yei River Valley. It's not a big contagious disease and widespread, so it's not very much known outside that part of the world. This little boy is going to die, you must confirm him. And I did, and it was at that moment that it became clear to me that who I confirm is not my decision. You present them, I confirm them. And that's how it goes. So I'm sorry, I've got bishop mouth. You just wind it up and turn it loose, and it goes. But questions you might have about anything that I've said.
This is the quietest I've ever heard that.
Yeah. You got it. Hooray.
Can you talk a little about the history of confirmation?
Oh, are you sure that you want to unpack that? So back in the good old days, the only minister of baptism was the bishop. Only minister of baptism was the bishop. So without the bishop, there was no baptism. And around the 3rd century, the bishops started to deputize presbyters, priests, to do that whenever and wherever the bishop could not be present. And over the course of several centuries, that deputation took a couple of tracks. In the West, the full shape of baptism included three actions. It included the water bath, the water rite. That's what we usually think of about when we think about baptism. It included the anointing with baptismal oil and the imposition of hands. Sometimes those two are described as separate acts. More generally, they're described as a single act. And then third is communion. So water rite, imposition of hands, and then communion. In the Christian West, the bishops started peeling, as the rite was delegated to priests, the bishops said, we think we'll save part of this sequence for ourselves. So in the West, confirmation was reserved to bishops. In the East, and Orthodoxy and the other related churches of the East, the bishops essentially decided if we're going to delegate anything, we're going to delegate everything. And that meant they delegated the oil also. So in the Christian East, it is always water bath, 3 times by immersion, just as God intended it. When I baptized my granddaughter, I dunked her 3 times, just as she was, 5 months old when I did it, just as God intended. Then my practice when I anoint is to be pretty generous with the oil, so I poured oil, didn't just smear a little dab, poured oil onto her, and then she received communion that day. So in the West, we got this split off rite that had its origin in baptism that we refer to as confirmation. And sure you want me to go down this path. You can shake it off and say, we've had enough, please stop. So at the time of the Reformation, it got more complicated, especially in terms of what happened in the first prayer books. The good news, I think, is that Thomas Cranmer, unlike the other reformers, Thomas Cranmer, who crafted the first 2 books of Common Prayer, 1549, 1552, he restored the sign of the cross at baptism. He didn't want to go so far as to use baptismal oil. 1549 prayer book did use chrism. 1552, under pressure, took the baptismal oil away, but kept the sign of the cross. But had this other thing called confirmation also. So, in a sense, Cranmer completed the baptismal rite as it had been in its historical structure, although without communion necessarily. That has less to do with baptism than in the high regard that developed over centuries for the receiving of communion. Louis the King, St. Louis, was known to be extraordinarily pious in his time because he received communion 4 times a year. So frequent communion was very uncommon. And so it was withheld ordinarily from people, infants in particular, at the time of their baptism. In the Christian East, nope. If you're going to baptize them, you're going to commune them at the same time. Yes? Well, yes, that is right. Did you hear what she said? You could not receive communion until you were confirmed. The exact language from the rubric governing that was that no one who was not confirmed or willing and desirous of being confirmed could receive communion. And, that mattered for a couple of centuries in British North America because there were no bishops roaming the land and nobody was confirmed. George Washington, a communicant himself, was never confirmed because there were no bishops on these shores until 1787? Yes. So yes, the normative practice was that you did not receive communion until you were confirmed. And part of that is that Thomas Cranmer saw this neat possibility of combining the need for catechesis with confirmation. So you had to be catechized before you were confirmed. And, that was a newfangled idea. For example, Queen Elizabeth I was confirmed 3 days after her baptism, when she was a tiny baby. And that's just the way that it went back in the day. Confirmation was not linked to catechesis the way that we simply assume that it is. And so sometimes that becomes a point of confusion for us, because how much do you have to understand in order to be confirmed? I've had a part to play, once in preparation and once in confirming, but in both instances, young women who were cognitively disabled. And they were not going to be catechized in the same straightforward way that we would expect. But were these young women ready for confirmation? Oh, you bet they were. You bet they were. But making the necessary changes for their circumstances. So it's a useful carrot for catechism, for being catechized, for learning, but sometimes we get them so closely linked that we can't really see anything else. Same thing about that little boy with nodding disease. He didn't get this stuff. He was ready to be confirmed. There it went again. My mouth just kept going. So, what questions? Yes? Yes.
Is that still the case? Is there anything in written law that says that, or?
Well, our canons assume that people will receive communion twice a year. In fact, it used to be codified just that way. A communicant in good standing receives communion twice a year. The assumption being that those would be when? Christmas and Easter. Yes. Now the canon reads that that to be a communicant in good standing, you have to be baptized, doesn't say confirmed, have to be baptized, and a giver of record, and in regular attendance at public worship. So that's a different spin. Giver of record, yes. Yes, right. And seriously, that becomes an issue when in really conflicted places where people who have not been around for several years show up for a parish meeting and expect to have seat, voice, and vote at that meeting. And it's really helpful to say, if you're going to be with us, you really got to be with us. You have to worship with us on a regular basis. And and a giver of record, I don't see your name here. So it's good discipline, not so much to keep people out, but to maintain the integrity of who gets to make decisions in the life of a parish. What else? Anything about baptism or confirmation you're curious about? Well, then, yes.
So here's a question that I always get from Father Jason. For those who may never be presented with Christ, how then is baptism the importance of it?
Right. He's for those who have never been presented with Christ, never heard about Jesus, what about them? So to me, the importance of baptism, and I think certainly since the 19th century, this is the way it's been treated within the Anglican communion at large. It's a great set of essays written in 1886 called Lux Mundi that deals a startling array of essays, one of which really put to rest any problem that the Anglican way of being Christian would have with this newfangled scientific idea called evolution. So it's really valuable for that piece alone. But there's also a piece in there about the public witness of baptism. And I think that baptism is crucial because it shows us and demonstrates to the world the fullness of what God intends in salvation. Not the only way that God intends salvation. But I think that those of us who have been passed through the waters of baptism have an obligation from that point forward. I remind my own children of this from time to time, and they snarl at me about that. It's not to say that we have a corner on the market of truth. It's to say that this is a sign, what happens at the font is what God intends, and in the fullness of time, I believe, what God will bring to pass. So what I'm saying is, whether you've heard of Jesus or not, you're going to get Jesus, either now or later. We who are baptized are obligated to live the way of Jesus, so that the sign implanted upon us might bear fruit and might really mean something in our lives and might actually matter to the world. And that's a huge issue these days. If you follow any of the polling about church and Christianity and belief, you will see that we don't have a lot of credibility these days. That the public views Christians as people who say a lot of stuff and don't live by it. Hypocrisy is a word closely associated with Christianity. And I think we've got to prove that notion wrong. that we must do. We must offer praise to God not only with our lips, but in our lives, to use those words from the general Thanksgiving. So that's kind of a long-winded, the only kind of answers I ever have are long-winded, so. Oh, that's good to know. That's about one question. Anything else about baptism? Anything, just anything in general? I'm happy to play Stump the Bishop for a while.
Not necessarily asking you to take a public stance on this, but I'm curious what you think about the church's conversation about open communion, especially
Ah.
what's going to be coming up at General Convention
Yeah.
this summer, just the ongoing back
Yeah.
and forth about that particular piece of canon.
I think she's asking about so-called open communion, which I refer to as communion of the unbaptized. I think that it's unfair to the unbaptized, those who have not been initiated into the death, resurrection, and new life of Jesus, to partake of the meal. And I also, the bishops of Jewish heritage, Jewish descent, in our house have been very, very firm in saying this. The open table does not make our families feel welcome. It makes them feel awkward. And so I think that we need to view it from other perspectives besides our own desire to be open and welcoming at the table. What is it like to be expected, and sometimes there has been pressure on guests just to go ahead and take communion? How does that work when a guest really doesn't know the etiquette of what goes on around the table? I understand the desire to include everybody. I'm just not convinced that it serves, that the open table serves that goal very well. I think it results in a lot more awkwardness than in welcome. And another thing that I simply have to say is that if we determine to do this, then we are opening ourselves to a world of hurt in terms of ecumenical agreements. There was an important document agreed in 1984, I believe, called Baptism, Eucharist, Ministry, that really makes it very clear that these are practices that we expect of all the churches, and the basic practice is baptism in the name of the triune God. And we would be in a world of hurt if the Episcopal Church were to walk away from that. I have voted every time that it's come up, and will vote again, against it. And it's before the committee that I serve on, prayer book, liturgy, and church music. We heard testimony just this past week about the matter, and there just wasn't much, there was not much of a taste for moving ahead with that. So, there it is. Yes?
You mentioned that prayer book. What is happening with the revisions of the prayer book?
Oh, revisions of the prayer book. It is moving blissfully slowly. So everybody recognizes that there are necessary changes. And some of the things that are going to change in the next prayer book is that there will be marriage rights for everybody. That almost happened the last General Convention, might happen this General Convention. We'll see. We have a very stepwise process for a new prayer book. And the first step of which is trial usage. So anything that will end up in a Book of Common Prayer necessarily will be field tested for at least one round. We actually have some services available for trial usage at this very time. And those include all the Eucharistic prayers in enriching our worship. Those are now a part of trial use. Feedback is welcome and expected. And there are also revised versions of prayers, A, B, and D, revised for inclusive language. Says expansive language, but it's really more for inclusive language. Those are available right now for use. So I was on the task force for prayer book revision and new liturgical materials this past triennium, which has turned out to be a quadrennium. And there are some very good materials and, frankly, some stuff that just makes me want to run screaming from the room. I think that we will not end up with the screaming from the room materials in a prayer book. One big change is that there is no commitment to publish a prayer book between boards as we have before. So a printed prayer book, the red book, I don't even see any. Where are the prayer books in this place? It may be available, there's a prayer book, may be available only in electronic version, which could still be printed out, but electronic version is going to be that's the go-to format. All righty?
I think we're good. Thank you all so much. Thanks for Bishop.
Yes, thank you.